Hello, welcome. I am so excited to be here with you all today. I know that many of you have put aside some time. We've got about a half an hour together, and I'm excited to spend some time talking about podcasting. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrea Sampson. I'm the CEO and executive thought leader coach at Talk Boutique. I'm also the founder of the Thought Leader Academy. You'll see a couple of, sorry, I always forget it backwards when I'm on screen, a couple of logos here. I have with me today, and I am so excited to introduce you to Donna Bishop. Donna is an in-demand host and interviewer. She is a podcast host of Fashion Talks. She is a fashion expert, and you might know her from CBC's Here and Now. Donna also helps others create podcasts. And so I thought she was the perfect guest to help me talk to you all about why it's important to be a podcast guest before you're a podcast host. So we're going to dive in. And for those of you who follow me, you may have seen the article I put out this week talking about this very thing. As a thought leader coach, we spend a lot of time talking about building your message, of course, but equally as important is building your brand and building your community. And when you're doing that, podcasting is one of the things that I constantly tell my clients they should be thinking about. And so many say to me, oh, I wouldn't know where to go about starting a podcast. And I always clarify and say, no, it's not about starting a podcast. It's about being a podcast guest. Because the reality is, before you're a host, you need an audience. That's your community. You also need to know what that message is and be really, really clear on it. And you need to get some practice. So we're going to dive deep into this. Welcome, Donna. Thank you.
Thank you.
And let's kick it off. So tell me, why is it important to be a guest?
Being a guest on a podcast is amazing for so many reasons. It is an opportunity to really hone your message. It's an opportunity to get used to hearing the sound of your own voice. I've done a lot of coaching around media training, around starting your own podcast. And it's amazing what a barrier that can be. We don't underestimate the panic that can come up before you even know it, when all of a sudden there's a microphone in front of you. So getting comfortable in that environment is so, so important. And it only comes with exposure. It only comes with doing it over and over and over again.
I love that that's where you start it with, because, and it's interesting, I talk a lot about using your voice. Now, I talk about it through the lens of your message, right? And so I say to my clients, and I say to anyone who I'm talking to who wants to really step into their own thought leadership, step into being on stages, is you've got to use your voice. Your voice is your tool to get your message out to the world. But what you're talking about is, and it's so interesting. So many of us are a little freaked out by the sound of our own voice. And I noticed today that you're wearing some iPod sort of old school.
I've gone back in time to 2010.
And I want to bring that up because I think this is part of it too. People think, oh, I've got to have all the equipment. I've got to have all the stuff. Right? And I don't think that's true. What do you think about that?
100%. So one of the interesting sunshine moments that has come out of COVID is the ability to make excellent audio content as a producer and as a guest skyrocketed. And now you do not need fancy mics, fancy headphones, fancy environments in order to effectively participate, or frankly host, but mostly participate in a podcast. I just have my literally circa 2010 mic manually plugged into my laptop. And this is absolutely all you need in order to start speaking, being a guest, creating audio content. The barrier of entry financially is slim to none. Do not be intimidated by technology.
And I think what's important about that too, there's no financial barrier. And as we hear ourselves, the more we hear ourselves, when we hear ourselves through technology, of course, we sound different than we sound in our own head. And so it's important that we start to get used to that sound of our voice, and the message that we're putting out there into the world. So as a podcast guest, of course, it's great when we're asked. And, sometimes it happens very serendipitously. I get DMs all the time from people who want me to be on their podcast, but that's not regular for most people, especially when you're just starting out. So how do you get tapped to be a podcast guest?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up that point about getting DM'd and whatnot, because of course that's the dream. We all love to be invited, correct?
Of course.
And the more you do it, the more likely it is that you will get that invitation. So it's a bit of a snowball effect. But how do you start? Especially if you aren't, hiring a publicist and have someone who understands the landscape. And the first thing you do is your own research and due diligence. Hopefully, or if you don't already, you're going to start researching what are the podcasts that speak to an audience that would be open and interested in my message. Because asking is the main thing. Do not be afraid to reach out to the producer, to reach out to the host and say, hey, this is who I am. Here's an example of my work. These are the kinds of things that make me relevant to your audience. I'd love to have a conversation about your booking process. And there's two pieces of that I really want to hone in on. The first is know who you are approaching. The podcast landscape is a wide ocean, Andrea. Like there is a podcast for every niche and every person and every interest. So surely, no matter what your message is, there is a podcast audience out there for you. Find them. Do not reach out to the people who are talking about marketing and say, I'd love to talk about bananas. Like, there is nothing more annoying as a producer, as a host, than being asked by someone who has no understanding what your podcast focus is, what you want to talk about. So be strategic, know who you're reaching out to, and understand the pieces of your message that are going to be the most relevant. So be really thoughtful in your pitch. Maybe they have had some prior guests on that relate to your topic. So you can say, I listened to past episodes about so-and-so and whatnot, and reference that, show that you understand what has been on the podcast before.
Be interested.
Be interested, become a listener, or at least an engaged, educated, aware before you reach out, so that you're really showing what they're talking about. And then be prepared for the collaborative nature. This is not I'm coming to read my personal dissertation. I would like to read 3 chapters of my book. The podcast has goals and intentions as well. So remember that this is something that you are doing in concert with someone, not something you're coming into, bulldoze and just have your moment on their platform.
I love that you talked about the fact that, look, you got to know a little bit about that podcast, and of course that makes sense. But I think equally, and you've said it, and I just want to pull it out, is that also know what your topic is. Also know what it is you want to get across. The podcast host has got goals. That audience watches or listens to that podcast because they get value from that podcast. So what value are you bringing to that podcast with your message? And so know what that is. And one of the things that I love, as a thought leader coach, is that, the very first thing I do with my clients is we surface, what is your core thought leadership? What is it that you're offering the world? And why is that important? And the thing that I find when I'm working with my clients is that we'll do that. We'll sort of get that message. And it's not an easy feat. I mean, when I'm working with TED speakers as an example, that can be really big, right? That's a big idea. So it'll take us a bit of time to get there. And when we first get there and it seems really great and they love it and I love it and we're really excited about it, but it's not until they've actually said a few times where it really lands and they start to really understand the impact of that message. And this is something that I think is really powerful about being a podcast guest. Because in a podcast, because often they are recorded, not always, but often, and often they're audio only. Again, not always, but often. It's less risk than being on a stage. If the first time you're going to say your message is on a stage in front of 10,000 people, that's high risk.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
so podcasts give us that opportunity to test our message. Tell me a little bit about your experience with that.
I think you are absolutely right that the nature of being a podcast guest, especially now, you're not even going to go to a studio probably. It'll probably be just like this when you are in your own office environment and you are speaking to someone through the computer. So I think automatically there is a less intense moment than if you're walking out onto a stage with lights and your pits are sweating and there's 1 or 10 or 100 or 1,000 people in front of you. It is a really excellent way to get used to speaking your thoughts out loud, because things can sound so brilliant in our heads, but as soon as we get in front of people, things can shatter. I don't know if we have any Succession watchers last night today, but if anyone watched episode 9, Roman, you know what I'm talking about. So having a chance in a really low stakes environment to get comfortable with that is really, really, really important, because you don't know how you're going to react. And then you're in the hands of your host, who is there with the safety net to help bring you back, to help guide you through the conversation, so that when you maybe start to go off course or you fumble a little bit, you're in a very safe place where you can experience what that feels like to lose yourself a little bit, but then come back, because it happens to absolutely everyone at some point all of the time. It is just part of being a human. It doesn't mean you're not good at it. It doesn't mean you can't do it again. It doesn't mean the conversation was a bust. It just means that you are new at it and you're a human.
Yeah. And I think, and I've done a lot of podcasts over the last couple of years. And I remember doing my first couple and being terrified. I mean, like you said, it's new and it's different, and you don't know what to expect those first couple of podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
But what I found, and what was interesting for me as a guest, was that, as I said, it helped me to really, really refine my message around the importance of thought leadership and why we need more diverse voices. But what it also did is it gave me a window into that podcast's view of the world, right? So now the questions that I was being asked were questions that I actually, in many cases, had never been asked, because I live in my own little window, of the world. And so I'm constantly looking through the same lens a lot. But being on a podcast helped me to see what it is that I speak about differently. And so, yeah, sometimes you go off on a tangent. So I think maybe the next question that I have for you as a podcast host, because you do this a lot, when you've got a client or you've got a guest who maybe is a little bit green and maybe is a little bit nervous, how do you help them? What are the things that you do that make it easier? Because I would think, as a podcast host, it's in your best interest that they succeed.
100%. And I am very upfront with my guests and say, I am not here to catch you in some sort of gotcha moment. I am here for you to shine. This is an act of collaboration. And I'm not unique that way. I think every podcast host and producer wants that. We want the conversation, the interview, the episode to be engaging, to be energetic, to be dynamic, to leave our audience going, wow, that was great. I can't wait to hear the next episode. Or really want to listen to that again. Like I want to pull more out of there.
Yeah.
So part of that is preparation. And hopefully your podcast host or producer, they might do a few things like do a pre-chat with you, where it's an off the record, off the air chat about like your message, and where you get to know each other a little bit, so you're not going in cold. Sometimes people might send you questions in advance, maybe not all of the questions, but here are the key beats that I want to talk about ahead of time. Those are two of the main things that hosts often do to really help prepare their guests. And if you aren't getting either of those things, ask for them. Say, hey,
Yeah.
I want to make sure that this is going to be as rich a conversation as possible. Can you give me an idea of what sort of themes or any specific questions, even the first ones that we might talk about? Is there a way to, maybe even have 10 minutes with the host before the recording happens? That's another thing that happens sometimes, is maybe you are booked for an hour, but the first 15, 20 minutes is off the air with the host. So you can warm up a little bit, like build a little bit of that rapport. And the other thing to do is, if you maybe get those questions in advance, or hopefully you are aware of the podcast and you kind of have a sense about what you want to talk about, practice, practice, practice. Stand in your bathroom. People are going to laugh. Stand in your bathroom so you're looking at yourself in the mirror, and pretend you've just been asked something that you're going to answer on that podcast, and answer watching yourself in the mirror. If you want to be really brave, record yourself answering those questions and play it back. And this is where people but there is nothing more powerful than listening to yourself answer those questions in advance, but certainly after you've done a podcast, listen to your episode. Yeah. Listen to your episode objectively. How was the tone of my voice? Did I sound excited to be there? What was my pace? Was it a little too fast? Was I talking a little too slow? Did the host have to interject and interrupt me to ask the next question? Get comfortable listening to your podcast episode afterwards. You will learn so much, and it will only create that more solid of a foundation for the next time you're asked to be a guest.
That's incredible advice. All of those things. Yes, yes, and yes. And the thing I would add to it, and again, because I do work with a lot of people who are on podcasts, if you have the benefit of having a coach, go work with your coach.
100%.
Because it is, still do all the things that Donna just said, absolutely, because you need to be comfortable with yourself, but also work with your coach. And the other thing I'd add to it is, sometimes hosts will ask you, what questions do you want to be asked? And that's also important. Have your own question bank ready so that you can, when somebody does ask you that, you go, oh, these are the things that I'd really like to be asked. The host will appreciate it. Now, they might ask you those things in a little different way because their audience is going to be wanting it in a different way. That's okay, but you've got it. So having those are really important. Now, today we're talking about being a podcast guest. And I think that there is something really important about being a good guest. And if we invite people to our homes, or when we walk into people's homes, we need to be a good guest, right? Well, when you're a podcast guest, you're walking into that host's home. And so they want you to, behave in a way that is commensurate with their audience. So what are the things that are important in being a good podcast guest?
Oh, this is such a great question, Andrea. I'm so glad we're talking about this, because this is such an important part of that collaborative process. Unless you are going on, Armchair Expert or Diary of a CEO, this podcast, and even them, podcasts are interested in building their audience, and they want their guests to play a part in that process. So before we even get to the interview, follow the podcast you're going to be on their socials, get familiar with how they share their episodes. When you are coming on for the actual conversation, excuse me, be punctual. These things sound obvious, pardon me, but be on time, be prepared, have some decent lighting set up your environment for success. Are they doing audio or audio and video recording? So you know what environment you're coming into. When it is done, share the content. This is one of the biggest gifts that you can give the podcast as a guest, and they will notice. And it will be something that other podcasts notice. Are you sharing the content organically, or are you just reposting what they have posted? Because we all know that an organic post carries way more weight in the algorithms of social media than just reposting something someone else has done. So ask them, what are the assets you'd like me to share? Can you send me the link? Ask them how to set you up for success to be a good guest when it comes to sharing their content. They will be so appreciative. And if you get an email with like, here's some examples, feel free to cut and paste this. Be grateful, cut and paste. Like,
Yeah.
don't be offended that they're trying to like tell you what to do. Be grateful that they are setting you up for success in something that will ultimately benefit both of you. Because being a podcast guest once is what you need in order to be a podcast guest twice. You build on your last conversation, because then you are using that in your own arsenal of thought leadership and why you should be invited to be to event X and podcast Y and be interviewed in other outlets. Use these things to bring your own message and your own expertise into the forefront. Do not let it lie in like the doldrums of your website and your social media feeds. Trumpet these things for the amazing opportunities and accomplishments that they are.
And they are. I mean,
They
are
are.
these are ways in which you are showing your authority and credibility as a thought leader. And so
Absolutely.
getting it out there, showing people where you're being asked, where you're being recognized. One of the things that happens usually at the end of every podcast that I've ever been a guest on, and I think most, is because you are having this relationship, this partnership with the podcast host, and they want you to share their content, they'll say to you usually at the end, where can my guests follow you? Where can they find you? Where can they, and this is the place where you, as the guest, get to start collecting your own audience. So one of the things that I always tell people before you go on any podcast, know where you're creating your community. Now, tell me as a podcast host why that's important and what you do with that and how you work with that.
It's such an important part because, as I know you talk to your clients in your network about this a lot, community is one of our most important, most valuable, most essential currencies in terms of sharing messages, sharing expertise, and growing any sort of brand, service, thought leadership. So respecting that is so important. And that community has its own objective, like its own intentions. They are there to get the expertise that you are sharing. So feed them what they're hungry for. Be respectful of how often you give them information, understand that the information you're giving them has a specific purpose, and really understand that symbiotic relationship. It's so important to nurture that, because that is what is going to grow ultimately your audience as well. That's why you are on the podcast, because you are hoping to reach people that didn't know about you already. So really digging into understanding the back and forth of that is so incredibly important. So don't be afraid to, say like, this is where you can follow me. I love getting a DM, like reach out to me. Make yourself available to this new community of people so that you can really start nurturing them and bring them into the tent of your community as well.
So, and I love that. I listen to a lot of podcasts and
Same.
yeah, I mean, they're fantastic. And why are they fantastic? Well, because you've got a host who has graciously curated a whole group of guests that are interesting on the topic upon which they're speaking. And this is something that it'd take me forever to do that same curation. And I think that's the point. When you're a podcast host, it's your job to actually deliver to your audience ongoing, interesting conversations. And those conversations, ultimately will result in, sure, greater listenership for your podcast. But equally as important, each one of those listeners is now enlightened to that guest's products, services, capabilities. I know for myself, I've gone out, not only have I followed many of the guests that I've listened to on various podcasts, but I've actually bought some of their products. I've subscribed to their services. Why? Because I actually didn't know it existed prior to. So I guess that's maybe my last question is, as a podcast host, as a podcast guest, is it okay to sell your product or service?
I think with any situation, there's a delicate dance there. And it's not about if, it's about how.
Mm.
Because you're probably there because you have something that you're selling. Maybe it's a book, maybe it's a service, maybe it's a workshop, maybe it's a platform subscription series. So you have something that you're selling. The host knows that, you know that, you want the audience to know that. So then the question becomes, how do you present that? Because what we know is that podcasting is one of the most effective advertising translations. Like, more people buy directly from a podcast than almost any other media outlet right now. It is an amazingly effective way to get that message out there. So understand how to do it in a way that is presenting it with value, not presenting it as an ask for receivership. And what do I mean by that? I mean, cloak it and cover it in a way that shows the power of it, the benefit of it, not the ask for the sale. And that's, I'm sure you talk about that with your guests a lot. In other situations, it's not about asking for the transaction. It is not a transactional moment. It is a benefit. It is an empowerment. It is an intention situation, which hopefully you, as the guest, are very comfortable talking about, because that's why you went into it in the first place. Hopefully you're passionate about whatever it is you're selling or offering, because you know the innate benefit of it in your bones. And that passion and that commitment and that authenticity should ooze out of you in a way that makes people excited to learn more. And that's another question that you can ask with your podcast host and producer is, what are the ways that you offer your audience more information about what I'm bringing to the table? Is it in a follow-up newsletter? Is it social media links? Is it in the show notes? Is it, do you have the opportunity to do a mid-roll ad? Sometimes that happens. There might be a financial transaction for that. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but ask about what their offerings are in terms of giving their audience the opportunity to purchase, if that is your ultimate goal. What does that look like for them in that context?
So I think what I've just heard you say is, ultimately, as a podcast guest, your job is first to come with passion.
Yeah.
Show up with passion for what it is you do and what it is that you believe in. Secondly, it's about offering value to that audience, the value of your knowledge, the value of whatever it is that you understand, and you offer that freely and openly as a guest in conversation and in relationship with that podcast host, because that's what it is. In the period of time that you're on that podcast, you are in relationship with the host and with the audience. And so
absolutely.
And so with any good audience or any good guest, at the end, you're going to offer up ways in which they can stay in touch, and maybe ways in which they might be able to sample or in some way, I guess, get access to what it is you offer. But you're not going to sell, because it's not about selling. It's about offering value.
And you can certainly have an exclusive offer for podcast listeners. Like if you have a promo code or something that you'd like to offer, it is super easy now for podcasters to drop that in, and you could agree on what the time frame is, so it doesn't live there, in perpetuity. You could say, like, for the next month, I'd love to offer your podcast listeners a promo code of whatever is reasonable for you. And then at the end of that month, it's really easy for them to pluck it out and either insert it with something else or not. So there is so much flexibility now in how those things can be inserted, mid-roll, end-roll, where are the show notes, that sort of thing. Don't be afraid to inquire about what some of those opportunities might be.
That's amazing. So Donna, I think we're coming up on time.
Already I could talk about podcasting all day. I am such a fan of the medium as a consumer and as a host and producer.
Honestly, it is such a hot topic and an important topic. And, maybe we'll come back and we'll do another live. What I thank you. So first of all, thank you. This has been incredibly enlightening. I think people have learned a lot. I'd love to be able to have people connect with you. Where can they connect with you?
You can connect with me on social media. My handle is at This Is Donna B, and that's just the letter B at the end. Or come to thisisdonnab.ca and you can see samples of my work. I love getting DMs. I love hearing from people, and I'd love to know what everyone's favorite podcast is because I am a huge fan.
Amazing, amazing. And thank you to the audience for being here. As I said earlier, I'm, the founder the Thought Leader Academy. If any of you out there are interested in the work that we're doing, and Donna is going to actually come inside the Thought Leader Academy at some point, we're going to do some work together, which I'm really excited for.
Likewise.
Make sure that you check it out. Go to our Talk Boutique page and you will see a link to the Thought Leader Academy there. And if you're not already following me on LinkedIn, make sure you do. I'm constantly putting out some really fun and great content around thought leadership, around community, branding, and messaging. Thank you all for being here with us today. Thank you again to my guest, Donna Bishop, and watch for this space because we'll be doing these lives on a pretty regular basis. Have an amazing rest of your day and a great weekend.